So I would say it's a conversation with the past, and sometimes the past is going to tell you something you don't like, but that's what happens in good conversations.
My name is Ben Charland, and I hope that you'll forgive my voice for being a bit under the weather this week as I give you this special edition of What on Earth is Going On. We did this show at Queen's University's Department of Classics on Thursday, March 21st, 2019, and we talked about what on earth is going on with our possession of the classical past. 3 panelists, Fabio Colivicchi, Desmond Wong, and Chloe Good, a professor, an alumnus, and a student at the Department of Classics at Queen's, and we talked about what this word possession means, and if it actually does fit or doesn't fit with how we view history. Now, if you like this show, as always, please give it a like on Facebook or Twitter or whatever platform that you use on social media, and give it a rating on iTunes if you can. For more information for any other episode as well, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. And please send me an email. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and your suggestions for guests of future episodes. Now, without further ado, here is this week's episode featuring a panel discussion followed by a question and answer at the Queen's University Department of Classics. All right, welcome to a live recording of What on Earth is Going On. Going to keep going? They're going to keep going. We are very thrilled to be here. I'm here on the panel with Fabio Colivicchi, Desmond Wong, and Chloe Good. They're all from the Classics Department. I'm going to get them to introduce themselves in just a moment. Before we do, I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Now, that's an important thing to say in any event. I think it's doubly important for this event tonight. I think that we need to recognize not only where we are, but where we come from. I think we need to recognize history as something, and heritage as something that we possess, that we own, or perhaps something that we have to relinquish ownership of. The title of the podcast tonight is Our Possession of the Classical Past. What on earth is going on with our possession of the classical past? That opens up a lot of different opportunities, a lot of avenues for exploration that we're going to get to this evening. But it's important to think about where we are now, not just where we're going. It's important to think not just where we're going to travel to, but where our feet are planted right here tonight. So before we get to that, we're going to ask the first question, which is always the same. What on earth is going on? I'm going to ask each panelist that question. But before we do that, we're going to get them to introduce themselves. So Fabio, just a couple words about who you are and where you come from.
Okay, hello. I'm Fabio Colivicchi, and I am originally from Florence, Italy. And life and classics brought me to Queen's 12 years ago, more or less. And I'm an archaeologist, and as an archaeologist, basically the past is my job. Our students this year had a nice motto, my degree is in ruins. And yes, my degree is in ruins, and ruins were good to me. And they brought me here. I ran an excavation with the help of very many of these students too, in Italy, where we deal with the past and the present and how they mix in a country which is very much about how the past can still be alive and with us. And I think it's all I want to say now.
And the ruins were good to you.
Oh, yeah.
I love that. That's great. Chloe.
Hi, so my name's Chloe Good. I'm a 4th-year classics major here at Queen's University. I focus on archaeology more than the linguistics and history side. I'm more of a tactile person than anything else. But yeah, what else do you want to know?
That's it? No, you did great.
Okay, perfect.
Cool. Desmond.
So my name's Desmond. In a past life, I was a student here at the Department of Classics. I'm now a very proud alumni of this department. Right now, I am the outreach librarian at the University of Toronto Libraries. I work with indigenous peoples. I am a settler. I trace my ancestry through China and Hong Kong, but I was actually born here in Canada, in Toronto, which is also Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee lands.
Right.
I'm really happy to be here today to talk about this really important topic.
Cool. My name is Ben. I'm the moderator of the panel, and I know nothing about classical studies. So, no, I've been researching this for the past couple of weeks, and it's been really fascinating to me. That, in some universities this is called Greek and Roman studies, in some places it's called classical studies, and in this university it's called classics, Department of Classics. Not the classics, which is a very interesting distinction. When people think of the classics, I guess they think of a symphony, or they might think of a work of art. And it's important to make that distinction. We're talking about a very specific area, region, period of history. But the arms of that, the tentacles of that history can touch many, many different places. And that's been really fascinating to me in my research and in the questions that we're going to ask tonight. So, Desmond, we're going to start with you. And it's that big first question, and you can take this anywhere you want. What on earth is going on?
So I was thinking about this question, and I think one thing that I really want to put out into the world is that really good work is still going on. I think one thing for people who are engaged in social justice and critical work like I am, it's very easy to furrow our eyebrows and to be really worried about the state of the world. And I think we will spend a lot of time through this conversation problematizing all the things that are happening right now. But one thing that I want to put across is that there are still people who are out there fighting the good fight, who are doing really beautiful critical work, who are really working with communities to revitalize things that have been taken away by settler colonialism, by heteropatriarchy. And I just wanted to give some space and to acknowledge that that work is ongoing, and that there, despite everything that we probably will talk about today, that there are people who are out there who should restore our faith and our hope in humanity.
Great answer. Okay, Chloe, what on earth is going on?
What on earth is going on for me is I kind of like to look at classics through my own lens. At home, I'm Mennonite, not Old Order, just New Order, and I don't go to church all that often, but it's interesting to see and study the way the classical world works through the eyes of someone who sees Old Order Mennonites all the time, and how they live still without electricity. They don't have cars. They don't have any modern things. The most modern they can get is a bicycle. And it's interesting to compare how those cultures work in a modern world versus how they worked in the ancient world, and then to compare them against a colonial mindset and how they've been interpreted in the past versus how they can be interpreted in the future and in the present.
Could I just ask, Chloe, what's the difference between Old Order and New Order?
They both follow the same set of rules in Bible, but Old Order Mennonites follow a more strict set of rules. So no electricity, no photos of themselves. They go to specific churches, and they have their own school system. And then they generally still work on the farm, and they stay within their own community. New Order, they don't follow the rules as strictly, so they can integrate with the modern world and use modern things, but they still read the same Bible and they have the same teachings.
And can I just ask before we move on?
Yeah.
When we're talking about the interaction with technology, it seems like it's also an interaction with history, with an interaction with the past. And obviously what we're talking about tonight is the past, is about history. Can you just briefly comment on that? I might be saying something that is out of left field and makes no sense, but it seems like there is a connection between history and technology there. And can you just comment on that?
Well, there definitely is. Storytelling has always been a way of keeping the past alive. And with technology, storytelling is so much broader now. There's so many different avenues and different types of mediums to use to storytell, whereas it's a lot more conservative without such technology. It's still oral or it's written, and there's a lot less diversity in it, but the stories I find can almost be stronger that way. They'll change through time, and they'll change depending on who's telling them, but it's still the same story, whereas with technology there's all sorts of different interpretations of the same story.
Well, and that's an interesting thing that we might talk about later, is this idea of oral traditions, right? Mm-hmm. Because in classical studies, a lot of this stuff has been written down and passed on for generations and generations, for, in some cases, thousands of years. And I think that we often forget that there are many traditions and cultures, such as the indigenous people in Canada, who have an oral tradition. And that isn't less or greater, but it's differently recorded. And I think the idea of recording history comes part and parcel with this idea of possession. Yeah. Fabio.
Well, if I can
Yes, please.
If I can jump in, actually, the Greeks were an oral culture for quite a long time. And even though they did start using writing early, their daily functioning was mostly oral. And that's the way, for instance, that's why they had an amazing memory, for instance. You were supposed to memorize a 1 hour long speech in court and your life depended on that, and you didn't read the script.
Well, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by Homer, which are seen as these paragons of classical literature, were oral, and they took hundreds of years before they were transcribed on paper. Just before we get to your question, Fabio, of what on earth is going on, how much of oral history in ancient Greece and ancient Rome do we know about? I mean, obviously we know what we know through written history and other elements, but how much do we know of what was orally, passed on from generation to generation?
Well, being oral, until they write it down, we're cursed. If there are no living people who pass that memory on, oral tradition dies. And that's the reason why, in the end, recording things is a good thing for people who come when that line, that connection line, that lifeline is broken. That's basically the only way for us to reconnect with those people, because their discourse, their line of thinking at a certain point was interrupted or merged with others and was kind of confused. And without written source, it is very difficult, but you can try. For instance, I'm an archaeologist, so I also work a lot with non-verbal language. For instance, you can look at images. You cannot hear the voices anymore, you cannot hear the music anymore, but you can look at images of people playing music or interacting with each other or dancing. You can look at their body language, you can look at the way they organize their spaces, the layout of a home can tell you something about what kind of social interaction was going on there. So you kind of try to get to the lost words, which we will never be able to hear, kind of through the back door, right, through little things they left behind. And in those days, nobody thought they were a language, but that's the language you can read now.
Well, and obviously there's the language that we use today, which still has many, many words or sources from Greek and Latin. But Fabio, I still got to ask you the question. Mm-hmm. What on earth is going on?
Okay, so following your advice, I try to come totally unprepared.
Excellent, that's what we're looking for.
And more unprepared than my students, former and past, which is a good thing for a change. So just a minute ago, I was just reading the flyer on the door. And okay, what is going on with our possession of a classical past? Is there anything which strikes me? And what strikes me is possession. Why do we need possession? Why it's so important to own things? Are there things you cannot actually own because they are not yours? They are not anybody's in particular. It's something in which we are, which, also the objects from the past. Sometimes we tend to identify the past with past objects, the Greek culture and the Greek temple. They are not exactly the same. And that's probably something that we have very ingrained in our mind, because in the end we are a consumer culture. We need to measure, quantify, touch, buy, sell, move from here to there, how much it costs. When you find something on an excavation, people want to know, okay, how much is it worth? Is it a museum piece?
Where can it go? Where can it be put? Where can it be displayed?
And how much? And is it rare? Is it a unique piece? If you tell them, well, no, it's not unique at all, it's something we know very well and we want to know what it means, you are happy because it's part of a puzzle, you can put it in a place, it speaks to you. And if I could disappoint people, so there are thousands of those, so it's worth nothing. So putting a price tag on the past who owns it because it's worth something, and it's worth something in money, basically. You cannot put a price on the past, and you cannot own the past, in case past owns you in its own way.
I'm so glad you mentioned this and are digging into this word possession, and it's part of the reason that we chose this as the subject matter tonight, because can we own the past, or who possesses the past, or who possesses artifacts of the past, because these things are possessed. The past as an idea or history as an idea is not owned, but the things are. Sites are. There are locations we can travel to as an archaeologist, and they are owned by a country, or they're protected by a country. Desmond, can you talk a little bit about this word possession and what it means to you in the context of this conversation or beyond?
Yeah, I think that the idea of possession, especially of the past, has been something that I've really struggled with throughout my time interacting with the classics as a classics student. For a long time, I think the classical past has been weaponized against indigenous peoples, especially around here, using classics as a space to exclude indigenous peoples or people who have come into contact with colonialism. I think one thing that is constantly talked about is that classics has been sort of held as the ideal of civilization, right? So the idea that the Roman Empire was the pinnacle of some foregone past. And I think that has moved forward into thinking in terms of possession around really troubling conversations around ethno-nationalism and white supremacy, where classics is used as a way to further marginalize already marginalized people. So I think of an example like a recent example with Professor Sarah Bond, who wrote a paper about polychromy, and it was not a political statement. It was just about her work around painting of statues, so like multicolored statues. And she was attacked by people who had alt-right and white supremacist leanings because they understood that those white statues were an extension of sort of the supremacy of the white race, is really the rhetoric in those spaces. And so, this truth challenging that is something that they couldn't accept. And so
just to be clear, Desmond, what you're talking about is, I have many things. If I go to Rome today, go to the Imperial Forum in Rome, or I go to Greece and the Parthenon in Greece or whatever, I see a lot of white marble statues, or I go to a museum, I see these white statues. From what I understand in my research, they actually weren't white at the time. They've become white over time.
Yes, to use a term that was often said by us when we were classic students, they were painted very Studio 54. They were very, very colorful. And that really, that affected this sort of idea of that the sort of the color whiteness is something that sort of extols white supremacy. So I think that really illuminated for me the fact that there is at least an attempt to possess the idea of the classical past. And I think that we, as people who have education in classics, have an obligation and a responsibility to shut that down, basically. I think one thing that I often see as well is this idea of sort of like an ethnic state of sorts. So there was a time at some point where there were large swaths of Europe where they didn't know that there were people who were of different ethnicities around, which we know as classic students or as students of the classics is not true, because there was never a time when people didn't know that people existed in what is now Africa, or there weren't trade routes to what is now the Middle East. Like there were always those contacts with, various the Parthian Empire, like the Persians, et cetera, et cetera.
Could I just ask you this thing about white statues having been painted very colorfully at the time? Is this something that people in knowledge have always known, or is this something we discovered?
I'm pretty sure that's something that we've always known.
Well, to a certain degree, yes. At least it became it was well known to those who read Latin sources, for instance, because Pliny is very clear. He says, for instance, that the best statues of sculpture so and so were those painted by painter so and so. It was a collaboration. So all learned people knew it and accepted it also because the statues of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were painted too. So polychromy for statues was almost always the norm. It became an aesthetic model only with the neoclassical period, when they started looking at classical statues, and some didn't realize that that white wasn't original. And then soon enough, when new excavations started in Greece, starting from the second half of the 19th century, the chorei of the Athenian Acropolis were found, and they were very visibly painted. So it was never a mistake. Actually, there is a period in European art when that actually was very well received, because it's the time of the Art Nouveau and everything very colorfully painted and patterned. So it really fit in the aesthetics of the time.
And yet when we watch the movie Gladiator, it's all white statues. No, really.
Yes.
Chloe, I want to bring you into this because I know that this is something that you think about a lot, and also this word monumentalization, which is an interesting one. But pick up where we're leaving off here and tell us a bit about not only possession, but this idea of, even though we know things to be true, we seem to believe something in our culture every day that's totally different.
Yeah, well, speaking on the topic of polychromy, there was a time when people would actually go around scrubbing paint off of the statues, because that's what they believed the statues should look like. That's what they wanted them to look like. So if they would find some paint on, they might actually scrub it off, which just helps reinforce the idea of just when people would go to visit these, like tourists and people who were using it for marketing, for tourism and whatnot, they would just see these white statues and they wouldn't know that they were supposed to be painted. So a lot of media now, you just see the pure white things, and that's how you think it's supposed to be, because you've never seen anything different than that. That's just what you've been shown and kind of taught in a way through the media of it.
So what is monumentalization? Am I saying that right? That's the right word?
Yeah. It's this idea that you're taking something they are monuments. They have a purpose, but it's to take something that is just a part of someone's life, like a part of the culture, and you're making it something that it maybe wasn't. You're creating something new in your own culture, especially with creating something, and you're turning it into something that it wasn't at the time.
And why would someone do that? Why is that just something we do preternaturally, or is there a, like Desmond was saying, a weaponized purpose to that?
It can be both ways. I don't ever like to think of something as it's just one way and that's it.
Right.
It can obviously be weaponized. It has been. But it can also just be for the aesthetics of something. Perhaps you've bought a piece of artwork and it has paint on it, and there's in the past you could just buy these things before there were things in place, and perhaps you just thought it looked better without paint, so you scrubbed it off, and there was no malicious intent behind that. That's just how you wanted it because it was yours, and that's how you wanted it to portray your own values.
Because you own it.
Yeah.
Because you possess it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also behind the idea of the white statue, also historically, there is not necessarily this racial intent. That is a very late and very ill-informed development. It's one of the things you find on the darkest side of the internet today, where you can find just about everything. But very rarely the whiteness of statues have been actually used in racialized terms in a average to high political, scientific, cultural discourse. Because everybody who had done above middle school knew that that wasn't true. That was simply an effect of time. Also, many of them knew that the white statue of the Renaissance, for instance, was on purpose. It was like a photographer doing black and white rather than color. Michelangelo liked a lot the white marble with no paint on, and he kind of broke out of the tradition of medieval, very brightly painted, because he wanted the form, the shape, the volume to be prevalent. So it's the same reason why somebody does black and white photography today rather than color. But they knew perfectly, and Michelangelo was the first who knew, because he did his Latin in school, and he was a pretty learned person.
Desmond, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that to follow what Dr. Colivicchi is saying, classics has been attempted to be possessed in those spaces specifically to fit within like specific ideological theories or ideological ideas, right? Because if you have, like Dr. Colivicchi was saying, if you have even a passing understanding of classics, you know that that's not true. I mean, you know that there were interactions between peoples. Like one of the things that we learn very early on is we see these like really messed up statues of lions because the Greeks didn't really know what a lion was, but the idea of the lion was slowly passed on from where there were lions to where there were not. And so we know that there was trade. Like we know that there were black people in Egypt. We know all of these things, and this idea of this mythical past with this supposed ethno-state is not true. Like I think objectively, like we know what the truth is, and that there's always been an intercultural exchange between people, especially in the classical world. And I think that's what I was saying when I say that when we know these things, we have an obligation to let people know, because that's really, one of the things that has been very valuable in the work that I do.
Well, and I think being a classicist or being a librarian, as you are, Desmond, and a classicist as well, we're looking for the truth. We want to tell the truth. And I think when we see something that is blatantly not true or against the truth, whether it's scrubbing a statue free of paint or telling a story that we just know isn't right, well, we know that we need to stand up against that and tell the truth. But there's something you mentioned earlier, Desmond, about, in our culture, we still do this. We still hold up the Roman Empire as being the paragon of everything that was great. We even still to this day compare the great Roman Empire with the eagles and the symbolism of it to the American Empire, quote unquote, today. There's a very clear line that people draw between the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, is that between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the United States and Nazi Germany, or whatever. I mean, this story is told over and over again. But we also live in a world, in the Western world, which is influenced by classical ideas and by Rome and Greece in antiquity. And what I mean by that is our laws, our codes, our norms are passed down from that. And of course, our education too, very importantly. For 170 years, Queen's University has had a classics department. For 170 years, this subject has been taught. That's longer than we've known most science and most ideas in science and most concepts. It's longer than we've known about the atom as we conceive of it today, unless we look at Democritus's atom back in antiquity, right? And so I guess my question is, there's a huge amount of influence from the classical past. How important is it for us to know the literal truth of that past in order for us to interpret how it should fit into our daily lives, or our laws, or our codes, our norms, our education system?
I think that you bring up a lot of really interesting points that I'd like to sort of address. So I want to actually root my answer back into the land that we are on right now. And so at the beginning, you had acknowledged the fact that we are on Anishinaabe and specifically also Haudenosaunee lands. We're also not very far from the Mohawks of Tyendinaga. While things were happening in the classical world, contemporaneously, Hiawatha and the Peacemaker and the Five Nations Confederacy of the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, was happening here on these lands. When you mentioned the eagle in the States, I think it's really easy to think about the eagle in terms of the Republic and classics and the Fasces, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that I've learned from a number of Haudenosaunee scholars and knowledge keepers is that Benjamin Franklin and people who were drafting the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States were actually really, really influenced by the work of the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee actually have, they originated the constitutions in these lands, and that was signified by the Five Nations wampum. And at the middle of the Five Nations wampum is the Tree of Peace, and above the Tree of Peace is actually a bald eagle. And that's where the bald eagle comes from, is it just so happens that they're symbols of peace and power for both cultures. And so I think that we don't spend, I think the thing is when we focus very heavily on the classical tradition, especially as it influences this space, we ignore where Indigenous peoples have had really serious contributions to our government systems, to our understandings of what settler colonialism is, without sort of talking about these contributions. And I think, to get to what you're saying, classics has been used as a way to exclude those conversations because it's very convenient to say the eagle and the eagle, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there is a not super hidden, but also not super well-known basis for Indigenous history that's within our collective understanding as well.
One concept that has come up in this conversation that I wanted to pick out is a quote from Professor Colivicchi. "You cannot own the past owns you." If we're going to use this word ownership or possession, in which direction does it go? Now, coming up in this conversation, we do interrogate this word and get to the bottom of it, but we also talk about the flux of today, the unifying principle of humor that connects us as a bridge to the past. And we also talk about the museum debate. What should museums do with artifacts that they hold from countries that want them back? One of these pieces is the Elgin Marbles, currently located at the British Museum in London, and they're originally from the Acropolis in Athens in Greece, and Greece wants them back. All that's coming up in this conversation of what on earth is going on.
Well, and Chloe, I want to ask you a question about this. And do you think that it's possible? Do you think it's plausible? Do you think we're maybe already doing it to combine these histories together? So we have very important Indigenous histories in Canada, but we also have this long lineage of the written classical tradition. Can they form not only a society, but a set of principles and norms in our Western world today, or in Canada specifically, maybe just specifically in Kingston? Can they come together, or is it important that we keep them distinct and protected from one another? What do you think?
I think that there's definitely the opportunity to bring them together. I think that they need to be respected as separate cultures and understand the differences in their creation and where they've come from and the circumstances that have influenced them. But I definitely think that all cultures can learn from each other. No culture is perfect. But I think that they can definitely come together, especially in a world like we have here in Kingston, where everyone wants to be so diverse and they want to learn new things and experience new cultures. I think they can definitely play off of each other and what's the word that I'm looking for? Just influence each other in a way to create a more interesting dynamic for the community.
Like a synthesis between the two.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's appropriate for us to sit around a table, maybe even have this conversation tonight, and say, here are the values that we want to take from here are the values that we want to take from here, and we're going to create a new synthesis from thesis and antithesis or whatever, and create a new melting pot of understanding and norms and codes? Or is that cultural appropriation? I mean, I know that I'm asking you an A and B question, and often I'm looking for the C in between, but what do you think?
I would say for us to do that right now at this moment, to sit down and do that would be cultural appropriation. I am not Native American, and I am not Roman in any way, shape, or form, and I don't feel that I have the right to decide what I want to take from those cultures and make them my own. I do think that they can definitely be learned from, and to understand the thought and the influences behind them can help someone grow as a person and to expand your own culture, but not to just decide that I like that, so I'm going to take it and make it mine.
Sorry, Desmond, one sec. Fabio, I'm going to let you go.
Okay, so, well, these are quite important issues. I would like to kind of shift the perspective. First of all, cultures tend to be, much more fluid and blurry things than my culture, your culture, and we know what you're talking about because usually you have no idea yourself. But I like to think of cultures that rather than drawing lines or deciding what they want to take or what they don't want other to take, cultures as cultural systems which look at each other, or perhaps not just the two cultures, but a number, and basically they recognize each other. Because the more you know about other supposedly culture, the more familiar they become. The less stranger, the less, foreign, alien they become. Sometimes they look strange only because you don't know them, because you have a very superficial understanding of those cultures. And I'm sure that many of the problems are based on the fact that people try to draw lines rather than, build bridges between cultures. And basically looking in each other culture's mirror, basically, and look at how similar we are. Because in fact we are. The more I know about the Greeks and the Romans of the age of Homer even, we're talking about people who are so far from us in time, and they lived in a world which was so vastly different. And still, they had the same basic human experience, the same basic understanding of what it is to be human and interacting with other humans without trampling each other and hurting each other and trying to make the right decision in difficult times. And when that happens, you don't think my culture, your culture anymore. It becomes really a flux which goes back and forth.
And is that what's happening today? I mean, this is a question for all you guys. Are we experiencing now in the 21st century a sort of a flux, a coming together of thousands of different cultures, whether we draw lines between them or accept that there are bridges between them? Are we coming together in a greater whole, and therefore is this new or seemingly new polarization a reaction of that, or is this just a general continuation? I mean, Desmond, you look like you've got a response.
I think that what we're describing in terms of what's being described in terms of the sort of intermixing of cultures is at the heart of it a relationship between cultures, and within that relationship comes accountability. And so I'm reminded of a teaching that comes with a wampum belt, the Guswenta, or the two-row wampum belt that was between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, where there is teachings around non-interference and respecting each other's cultures and respecting the way that people do things in terms of their lives. And that is something that's sort of central to the way that the Haudenosaunee operate and the way that they think. I think that I completely agree with what Dr. Colivicchi says, which is that when you have more of an interchanging and exchanging of cultures, that there's less fear and there's less division. And I think that that's something that we desperately lack, and something that on the deepest, darkest parts of the internet is not something that we really interact with all that frequently, is people who challenge us and our thoughts. We sort of build ourselves these echo chambers. From an information perspective, as someone who does work in information, I think that that doesn't challenge us, and it doesn't, it brings really difficult, it avoids really difficult conversations. Having said that, I also know and understand that there's a lot of labor that's involved in those kinds of conversations, and that for a lot of people, they can feel really unsafe in those conversations. But I think we need to get back to a point where there's at least axiomatically a line where we recognize the humanity in other people. And I think that that's something that we're largely not seeing in the cultural conversation right now.
Chloe.
Yeah, just like this conversation reminded me as like a current student of classics, I always think whenever I'm learning about the new cultures of ancient people, it is sometimes somewhat alien to learn new things, but it also it always creeps up on me and strikes me just how similar people are. Like learning about graffiti and things. You see some graffiti and you see what someone writing, and you're like, wow, I know somebody who did that last week.
You mean when you see graffiti done like 2,000 years ago,
Yeah.
and it's still present today?
Yeah, like you see something, somebody scratched into a stone, like Jason was here, and like people are different, but they're also the same. People seem to kind of have the same fundamental wants and needs, even as their cultures differ. There's still some things that stay the same and is recognizable as a human trait across cultures and time.
And one of those needs being to scratch my name into a rock. You know?
Also dicks.
Yes, those are always
The current
popping out.
favorite.
Yeah. Who wants to take that one? Anyone? Desmond, go ahead. You started it. Explain yourself.
Oh, sure. Well, once upon a time, I was taking a tour through Ephesus, and
where's that? Sorry,
in Turkey. It's now in Kuşadası, Turkey, and it was a really big city. And they always take some time to point out one of the earliest pieces of graffiti in Ephesus, which is just a giant phallus. So I don't. Awesome. Yeah, I feel like every kind of like crappy 12-year-old thinks that they're reinventing the wheel when they like draw a dick on a TV or something, but they're not. I'm here to crush your dreams.
Fabio, would you like to respond to the dick thread?
Well, I don't know where to start. Because if you do Greek art, they're all over the place.
It's something that I learned. I studied theater, and in the theater you study Greek drama, and the phalluses are everywhere. Mm-hmm. They seem to be not just an ornation, but the center to many of these plays, many of the writings, many of the graffiti that we see. It's all over the place, and we subsume it in many ways in our culture, but everyone knows that women receive dick pics on Tinder all the time. And I know this is a tangent, but tangents are welcome here. But there's this fascination with the sexual organ, male and female, that, again, connects us across time. It connects us across culture. I don't think any culture or any person throughout human history would misunderstand the joke, right? Kind of, I mean, this is getting crude, but kind of like a fart joke. We all get it. We all get that it's a bit funny and humiliating, and we all get that it's a bit silly. But we all get it. I don't think there's anyone outside of that sphere. And so I guess if we're talking about building bridges, dicks and farts are the way to do it. Sorry, this is getting way too crude. Someone save us from this, please.
Well, we can start moving towards a Greek comedy, for instance, where there is a lot of that. There is a lot of farts and really bad humor, but at the same time, those are fantastic works of fantasy about possibilities, about little people who do impossible things like building cities up on the clouds, or solving the problem of peace of war, or reinventing gender roles. All of the above, while basically having a huge leather phallus hanging up. And people took them not so seriously and seriously at the same time, because the two things can be together. One of the lessons from Greek culture, for instance, is that opposites are connected, and you need to reconcile them. It's not either or; it's both of them in the right proportion. It's all about where you put your right balance. It's all about that, and in many ways. Some strands of modern culture, I would say, that are still based on these kind of ultimately, I would say, religious in an extreme way notion of good versus evil. So you need to go for what is good versus what is bad. Well, there is nothing totally good and totally bad in Greek culture. It depends on in what proportion, in what context, in what amount. They have the same word to say poison and medicine, and that tells you a lot. So it's a word of shades rather than a world of, light and darkness. And so you have, some of the highest and most universal meanings, and at the same time you have a fart joke. And they can happily live together.
I think one thing that I really value from my education here at Queen's and also through classics is exactly what Dr. Colivicchi is describing, which is like the idea of liminality. And I think that for us as a culture, as a society, we're not very good at talking or being comfortable in liminal spaces, where I think the Romans and the Greeks really taught me that there is a lot of room in between. So the idea of the good and the bad, male and female, what is gender? I think these are conversations that are still ongoing, but it was a conversation that isn't new. I think that's one thing that I constantly want to try to tell people, is that the idea of there not being binary genders, or not being like a binary understanding of being queer, or you belong or you don't belong. These things, like these different shades, have always existed and have always been part of the human experience. And it's through my classical education that I was able to have that perspective, to know that these conversations have always been going. Like indigenous people have had two-spirit people. Lysistrata had all sorts of weird stuff happening, millionaire's dinner party. I mean, we can go on and on, right? There are just many, many examples where not only did people celebrate liminality, they really leaned into it as well.
Could you just what is liminality? Could you just define that?
It's just the state of being in between.
The state of being in between, yeah. Like the state kind of like before you go to sleep or when you wake up in the morning, between waking and dreaming. It's an example.
Sure, yeah. I think I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've studied Latin, but I think liminality comes from the Latin word limen. Is that correct? The threshold?
The threshold.
Yeah.
It's being, moving between two different spaces, being at a passage, at a frontier, at a no man's land, basically.
Which is so interesting, this concept of liminality, because we're talking about possession, which for many people is not liminal at all. It's not in between. It is mine or it is yours. And of course, history and storytelling exists in between these. And I do want to bring up the debate that's going on, and it's been going on for a long time, between museums who own, quote unquote, pieces of art or artifacts or culture, and there are people who want them back. In Egypt, in Greece, they want these pieces of artifacts brought back. They want them repatriated to them. And there are many examples of this, but it is a difficult argument, because these museums, these paragons of culture and the power of knowledge, will say, if we return it to Egypt, it will get destroyed. If we return it to Syria or Iraq, it will get looted and ISIS will blow it up. Now, that may be a ridiculous argument, but it's not like the people who are working in these museums are stupid. In fact, many of them have the same education that you guys do. So I want to bring up this debate, and very, very quickly, could you guys just, one at a time, tell me what you think of this and maybe what we're not seeing, what's behind it?
Who starts?
Go ahead, Fabio.
Okay, well, I have a liminal position here because I don't have a clear-cut answer. I think much depends on a number of factors. First of all, those things are more important to whom? So how much do they care about that? What role does it play in their culture? So, for instance, I would argue, and that's probably kind of an unpopular argument in some places, but that when the Elgin Marbles were brought from Greece to London, it was a kind of a justified operation, because to the Brits, those were incredibly important. They were rethinking themselves as the new Greeks. In those years, Stuart Mills was writing down that the Battle of Marathon was an event of British history. Because without the Battle of Marathon, he wrote, and of course he was fantasizing, the Britons would be still wandering in the woods. So for them it was their history. And at the same time, instead, Greece wasn't Greece yet. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire. It was a very divided and complex situation. Then the thing all completely shifted. Now it's 360 degrees, and now they are much more important to the Greeks of today than to the Brits of today, who have moved away almost completely from that idea of being the new Athens and simply like to have a nice museum piece in the British Museum for tourists to take photos. But for the Greeks, that's basically the heart and soul of the nation, their identity. So I would say that now it would make sense for them to come back. And that's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, talking about possession. We should think of ourselves not as owners, but as custodians, as guardians, and people who take good care of what's left of the past, of the words of the past in verbal form, in art form, or simply just pots and pans of some time far away, because they will keep on speaking to people in the past, and they need to be able to read those words of the past as much as we do, and make up their own mind about what they mean, because each age has totally different readings of the same past. So probably also because I grew up in Italy, where we have so much of these heritage, and it's everywhere. It's even in the houses you live in. My place in Florence dates to the foundation of it to the 11th century, and you live in it, and it's a part of your daily life. So for you, it's not a monument, as you said, but it's a part of a kind of an interrupted line which brings you back to, you cannot even stop. Mm-hmm. You don't know when. But probably the future of the ownership issue is, thinking of institutions like museums and cultural heritage ministries and organizations as custodians who have a responsibility, and also the responsibility to give up on possession when it's time.
And redefine the word, I think. And sorry, I'm going to cut you off, but because I need Chloe to, what's your response to this, Chloe?
Well, I had a checklist of points that I wanted to talk about, and you just checked off all of them.
Oh, sorry.
I kind of have a question about it, though, for Desmond. What's your opinion on the difference between something like the Elgin Marbles and something that's organic? Something of the natives that isn't as long-lasting as the marbles. Like, what's your difference of opinion there?
Yeah, I think that's a conversation that happens a lot through both lines of work. So when I was in classics, I thought about the Elgin Marbles a lot. And then as a librarian that works with Indigenous peoples now, I think about cultural heritage of Indigenous peoples a lot. I had a colleague who really challenged my thinking about what it means to possess and what it means to care. So I think when we talk about sort of modern museological practice, when we're talking about caring for something, we're really just talking about making sure that it doesn't get eaten by rats and it doesn't fall apart, that there's some conservation effort with it. But what she challenged me from a community perspective, from an Indigenous community perspective, because she's Anishinaabe, is whether these objects are being cared for in the way that they were originally intended. So for a lot of Indigenous objects, they're sacred, they're created for ceremony, they're meant to be used by the community for the community, and that's the appropriate use of the object. And they're not fulfilling their obligations to the community, and the community has essentially a big hole in their heart where these objects are, these objects that connect them back to their ancestors who have been walking on these lands and caring for these lands since time immemorial. And I think that I see a lot of those connections with how the Greeks now feel about the Elgin Marbles, whereas Indigenous people have always known that they were the stewards of these lands. They've always known that these objects are important to them and they were essentially taken from them. I think that we can really draw parallels to the importance to what these objects mean to national consciousness of a specific place.
This is so interesting because Fabio mentioned, the idea of possession maybe being one of custodianship, and Aboriginal peoples in Canada and North America were custodians who have had ownership imposed, in this paradigm of ownership imposed. I think it's really interesting. We're going to move on to questions from the audience, but I do want to note that I've learned in this conversation with the three of you why it's so important to have a classical education. You guys have kind of reaffirmed for me it's not just to understand the way that our laws work, or the way that Canada descends from Roman and Greek times or whatever, which is only partly true, but to understand the connections, the access points between all of the things that we talk about. I think you're enabled to do that by the education that you guys have. So thank you for that. We're going to turn to questions from the audience. Yeah, what makes classics distinct from other subjects? But there's more to that question. But yeah, who wants to take a stab at that one?
Okay, I'll start. Yeah. I think for me, the thing that separates classics from any of the other fields is specifically how multidisciplinarity is built into the idea of classics. And so for me, when I first approached classics, I came from it purely from a language perspective. So I studied Latin in high school because I had a lot of friends and I was really popular. So that was sort of my whole understanding of classics. And then when I came to university, I really found that classics was so much more than that. I actually ended up working with Dr. Colivicchi on a thesis that would be very much understood more as probably art history. We learn about history. There's a really strong archaeology component here at the department. Classics takes on the distinct flavor of who is in the department. And I think that that's what makes classics such a distinct community and such a distinct subject to me, is the fact that it is very much on an individual basis how you approach the classical world. There are people who are doing some really interesting and beautiful work about like things like queer theory and gender roles within classics. They're taking a postmodern approach, and that's also fully within the classics as well. And I think that that space to explore the ancient world in a way that isn't constrained specifically by these like very arbitrary and very strict boundaries is, I think, what the strength of classical studies and classical education is.
So my question, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is working, okay. So my question is, I'm getting that we don't like the word possession. So I would ask you how to rephrase this conversation that we're having. Instead of saying that it is possession of the classical past, that's not really what I'm hearing the conversation as being about. So do you want to propose a different possibility?
You're asking me specifically?
Or any of you.
Well, I would rephrase our conversation with the classical past, something like that. Because it's a back and forth, it's open, you don't know where it's going to go. And one of the good things about classics, just to reconnect with the other, is that it's a whole world. It's a whole society which includes more or less everything from a certain group of people, a very large group of people from a very long time, but it's deeply interconnected, and there is science, there is medicine, there is material culture in all form and shape, there is poetry, there is graffiti on the wall, and it's also, as it was probably mentioned already, the good thing is that it's not now, it's great that it's the past, because the past is a kind of, to use a word, a concept which I perfectly don't like very much in its declension of today, but it's a safe space, because you can be more daring, more bold, more you are more free when you deal with the past than when you deal with issues of just 15 minutes ago. And you have more room to explore. So I would say it's a conversation with the past, and sometimes the past is going to tell you something you don't like. But that's what happens in good conversations.
I think similarly, I would say that I sort of interpret my time here as understanding my relationship to the classical world. Similarly in the way that I understand my relationship as a person who exists on indigenous lands, as a settler, et cetera, et cetera. I think that, like Dr. Colivicchi was saying, when we learn about the classical past, it's very much an interpretation of what actually happened, right? Everything, all the scholarly outputs that are coming out of classics are sort of funneled through our own specific perspectives and lenses. And I think that is an articulation of my relationship to classics as I stand here right now in this moment. I think that it is just, I really just see it as like relational.
Chloe?
The possession's obviously not a good word. I like to kind of think of it as an interpretation and discovery of like a finite resource, because the past is funny in that it is finite, but it's also infinite in that like time is just moving forward. Like we keep creating a new past, but it's what is there of the ancient past. There's only so much of it. It's not being recreated. So it's a discovery, an interpretation of something that we can't be sure we're understanding, but it's something to be discovered and respected and just enhance our understanding of humans and human nature.
And could I go for one more? Because I would also say that, we study the classical past. Other people study other cultures. Other people study indigenous cultures. All of these cultures are important. So the other thing I would just, say is, why study cultures versus, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on STEM today in society. So why do we think that the study of cultures is so important? Assuming you do think it's important.
I think it goes back to the idea of like when you understand a culture and you understand that at the heart of culture is the human experience and humanity. I think in humanities you see humanity in people. I think one thing that I find very troubling about the tech space and about STEM is that it often removes people from the equation altogether. You hear about things like startups disrupting and reinventing things that are not don't really need to be disrupted and reinvented. There are all sorts of stories about like tech startups thinking about like reinventing and disrupting this thing, and people look at the sum total of all of their propositions and they say, oh, you've just reinvented a grocery store. Like we already have one of those things. And it's very rare that they disrupt things that actually get to the heart of the human experience. Like, why don't you disrupt hunger or poverty? Why is it always, why do you always have to frame your disruption in this sort of capitalist neoliberal framework? But I think that's where the strength of the humanities lies, is that it's the human part of the humanities.
Yeah, I would agree with that, just in that it to understand people who came before you is a better way to understand yourself, and different paths that you could take and ways that you can grow as a person and explore your own experience in the time that you live it. Just to, yeah.
Well, I would just say that we need to tell the STEM people that they are humanities too, even if they don't remember, because it's where they came from. Math came out of philosophy, and physics came out of philosophy, and philosophy came out of Greek poets, and so everything is humanity because it's a human product. Even though we have made and recently, it's not an old thing, we have made a part of our cultural production into a kind of an autonomous machine which works by itself and we should just worship. And, just to take a closer look, and, STEM is a humanity too. They need to be reminded.
I just wanted to bring the conversation back to museums for a moment because it's my area of interest.
Well, museums are institutions that change together with the society which produces them, also because a museum is originally a place for the muses. And in Alexandria, they put it together as a cultural institution which was supposed to produce all kind of knowledge and knowledge was power. And that's the reason why the museum was a part of the royal palace, basically. And, well, knowledge and production of knowledge and control of knowledge is part of power. So as ways power is articulated, change, museums change. So the discourse you get in a museum, well, it depends on when that museum was created. So sometimes you have some historical exhibition which really still have the stamp of the time when they were put together. And they kind of resonate in a strange way, kind of feels out of place. And there are museums which instead have been reframed and reorganized to speak in a language which we understand better. For instance, to include a different perspective, or to focus on things which weren't valued before, or to put them simply in an order, or in, well, talking about polychromy, for instance, the Assyrian reliefs, which were also completely painted, of the British Museum. Now you can see them with a projector actually projecting color on them. And you can see a very different image of them. And I think it's a very beautiful operation they did there at the British Museum without actually, altering the piece, because also the fact that most of that paint is gone is also a part of the history of the object. So you don't want to just paint over just to make it look like it was in the good old times. So yes, museum will keep on changing. Perhaps will lose their classically based name and they will become something else. But they are cultural institutions where the past is put on, well, on display when they don't work very well, in a conversation when they do work with current society, and they are there to they are text, basically, and like all texts, somebody put those words in order to mean something. And future generation will put those words in a totally different way, add some, cut others, and they will say something else. So, yeah, museums are a part of our relationship with the past.
I also think of museums as a layer of interpretation, or a discovery layer, as we might say, in the library world, where everything that you're looking at the museum is not neutral. It's someone has laid it out and they're describing specifically the object, at least in the modern understanding of a museum, not necessarily as a home for the muses. I think that museums are currently undergoing a really interesting conversation, which is recognizing the power that they hold as sort of being seen as like a place of learning, as a place where people are approaching like classical cultures for the first time, or indigenous cultures potentially for the first time, and understanding what kind of power that holds and also what that means for them as an institution. And I think that those conversations are really interesting. I know a number of museums are now, especially ones that possess a lot of colonial objects, are actually talking about how they got those items and why they might not know the provenance of those items, whether they were taken because of colonialism, largely because they were taken because of colonialism, and also, why and how they're being kept away from the communities and the nations that created them. I think that that's a conversation that people maybe don't necessarily associate with the museum unless they're like really deep into the museum, but it's something that we need to think about if it's the first time. I know that I certainly came into contact with the classical world for the first time when I went to the Royal Ontario Museum, for instance. And I think that these are conversations that need to be had with patrons because they need to know.
Mm-hmm. I think that museums, I'm really glad that they're acknowledging a lot of the history of the colonialism and taking things that they maybe shouldn't be in possession of. But I do think of museums as a place of learning and a place that people can go to get a really diverse understanding of different cultures all in one space. It's accessible to a certain degree. It's a simplified yet diverse understanding of different cultures and different objects in one space that allows people to have a broader understanding of how things may work together. It depends on how the museum is laid out, of course, and what it is focusing on and who's curated that exhibit specifically. But for example, like the Raw Museum, you can travel from say Rome to Greece and to Egypt and then to the dinosaurs, and you can get a sense of how some things may work together. Like you can see the similarities between Rome and Greece without actually having to travel to Rome and Greece. It's a somewhat more of an accessible means of education for people, bearing the uncertainty of the possession of those objects. It's still a way for people to learn about those cultures.
Okay, thanks so much for your questions. We're going to close up now, but I do have one final question for you guys on the panel, and that is this word possession. Now, the title of tonight's talk was meant to be a bit provocative because I know that this is a word, possession, which has a lot of difficulty. It's very challenged, and when we talk about possession, we're forced to ask the question of, do we possess? What does it mean to possess? What other words can we use instead of possess? And that's my last question to you. So just in one word, if each of you can tell me, if you could replace that word possession with something else, what would that be? Fabio.
Well, I think in my previous answer I said dialogue, conversation, and that would be my choice.
That's great. That's what we're doing now. That's perfect. Chloe.
A reinterpretation.
Reinterpretation. Great. Desmond.
Relationship.
Relationship. And they're all very similar, those three words. Yeah, thank you so much, you guys on the panel, Chloe, Desmond, Fabio, and thank you to the audience for coming. This has been a really, really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
To learn more about this conversation or about our panel, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes as well as a way to get in touch with me to let me know about what you thought about this show and to give me your suggestions for future episodes. Now, your quote of the week is from the classical philosopher Aristotle. Here goes. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Thanks, as always, to our composer, Andrea Wetstein. Thank you to Fabio Colivicchi and Desmond Wong. And special thanks to our third panelist, Chloe Good, who stepped in at the very last minute and did an excellent job. Next week, we're talking with Jessica Vomiero, Global News national online journalist, about disruption in the media. I'll see you then.